Hey guys, this is Nick and welcome to your Linux and open source news for the end of November 2020. This month we have the Librem 5 finally shipping to backers, a new open source Chrome OS alternative, Google being more open with Chromium, and tons of Linux gaming improvement. Let's take a look right after, no, we don't have a sponsor for that one, so I'll just tell you that you can help support the channel through Patreon or by becoming a member of the channel on YouTube. Links are in the description. Patrons and members get access to a weekly Patroncast and can vote each month on the next topics I'll cover. You can also buy some pretty acceptable merch from the link in the description. Now let's move on to the Linux news. Ubuntu Web Remix was announced, and it's an interesting project. It's built as an open source alternative to Chrome OS and employs Firefox instead of Chrome or Chromium. It comes with its own WAPP format for web app packaging, with an experimental web app store as well, which seems to contain very little right now, as would be expected for a project that has just begun. Interestingly, it also supports /e cloud services by default, so you can get your own email address, contacts, calendars, and small storage space immediately. It also has experimental Android app support through Nbox, so it might be interesting to see how that shapes up, as it could be a very interesting replacement for Chrome OS on these Chromebooks. Linus Torvalds has expressed interest in the latest Apple M1 Macs, which, for those who don't know, are custom designed processors that will only be appearing in Apple's Macs and that are pretty freaking amazing in terms of performance and battery life. Linus said he'd love to have one of these devices if it ran Linux. Unfortunately, it doesn't as of now, but I'm pretty certain that the amazing Linux community will find a way to get Linux in there if Apple hasn't put too many roadblocks to dual boot on these devices. I'll admit an M1 MacBook Air running Linux would be a dream to me with Apple's build quality and the freedom and power of Linux. Now onto the hardware news. AMD released their Radeon RX 6800 and 6800 XT graphics cards. While these seem very powerful, tickling Nvidia on their higher-end models, the launch day situation is far from optimal on Linux. AMD has official drivers out, but these only support Ubuntu 20.04 and Red Hat or CentOS 7.9 and 8.2. If you want to go the open source route, you'll need the Linux kernel version 5.9 and Mesa drivers 20.2, which means that most non-rolling release distros won't support these cards out of the box. This is a shame, as AMD could easily have sent a few cards back to the Mesa team so they could prepare for this in advance. NDAs do exist to avoid major leakage of information, so I don't see why AMD didn't go through with that. Let's hope these drivers can be included in hardware enablement stacks soon in various distros so these cards can be supported. The Librem 5 as a mass-produced phone is now finally starting to ship to backers. After multiple years in development and multiple setbacks and delays, Purism made good on their promise and started shipping the final device. I'm really interested in seeing how well this device will run Phosh, their own spin on GNOME Shell for phones, and how many of the GNOME apps have been updated to be responsive and usable on a phone screen. I'll be the first to admit I was very skeptical about that phone and it really shipping, but now that it's out, I'll eat my words and wait for people to review the device. Tuxedo launched yet another Linux laptop called the XMG Fusion 15. It boasts a 1080p 144Hz screen, an Intel Core i7 processor 9th gen, and an RTX 2070 Max-Q, and an opto-mechanical keyboard, whatever that could be. It can go up to 64GB of RAM, 4TB of SSD storage, and comes pre-installed, of course, with Linux. It's also an expensive beast at around €1,400 for the base model with a GTX 1660, 8GB of RAM and 250GB of SSD. The design looks good, although a bit chunky at 20mm thickness. It seems to be a design collaboration to bring full Linux support to an already existing device, but it's still good to see yet more Linux hardware, although I feel the lower end of the spectrum, by which I mean cheap laptops, doesn't seem that well covered these days. Moving on to the open source news, Proton, the company behind Proton Mail and Proton VPN, has enabled early access to Proton Drive, their online storage offer. Most paid users of Proton Mail Plus will now have access to it as a beta. It offers end-to-end encrypted storage with the same method used in Proton Mail. It's also accessible through any web browser, but there are no mobile or desktop apps as of yet, or link sharing, but it should come soon. There doesn't seem to be any details available yet as to how much storage Proton Drive will offer or how much it will cost, but I'll keep an eye out. There was an interesting article published after the announcement of the PinePhone KDE Community Edition, which points out to critics that the phone might be weaker than what people are used to and that it's not a flagship, but that it's also not the point. The article highlights the fact that this is a first effort to provide tested and supported hardware, which usually means older hardware. It's intended as an enthusiast and developer test bed for developing new mobile-friendly graphical environments, and as such, it's not intended to compete with the likes of the latest iPhones and Galaxy phones. It's an interesting quick read. As always, you'll find a link in the description. YouTube DL has been reinstated by GitHub after the project's repository had been taken down following a DMCA request. GitHub received a letter from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, who explained that Google has no specific protections to hinder the download of YouTube videos, and as such, YouTube DL does not circumvent anything at all, and is doing nothing a user couldn't do themselves. It's good to see these projects being defended from the outside, and it's good to see that GitHub listened, although this defense line might make YouTube decide to actually put up barriers to downloading videos, which would be an unfortunate consequence. I happened upon a very interesting article about OpenStreetMap and how it's currently being used and contributed to by the biggest companies in the world, namely Apple, Facebook, Amazon or Microsoft. OSM is now the source for most big companies' mapping efforts, and these companies are really active, especially in the road mapping department, where non-corporate contributors now account for less than 25% of the editing activity. Apple is the biggest corporate contributor, with Amazon coming second. This doesn't seem to go well with the community, seeing corporate involvement as an intrusion on the project. I'll leave a link to the lengthy article in the description below. Check it out, it's a really interesting example of how open source and corporations interact together. The longtime viewers will know I'm not a big fan of Google or of Blink, their web rendering engine, but it seems like Google is taking steps to please me. Well, probably not that, but at least they're opening up Chromium and Blink to more outside developers. Manuel Rego Casanovas from open source company Igalia has joined the governance team, which means that Google isn't alone in accepting or refusing the various changes proposed to Chromium. This is a start to alleviate my fears that Google might end up controlling how the web is rendered and the future technologies that are allowed in it or not. More features are also accepted into Chromium, even if Google doesn't want to add them to Chrome, so that's another step in the right direction. Moving on to the gaming news, and Lutris 0.5.8 was released, and despite the small version number, it's a huge improvement. The game manager is now better integrated with the Lutris website that lets you download game installers, and games from third-party services no longer depend on a Lutris install script, which means you can just install them as is, even if they don't have an install script. Steam games are now loaded through the Steam API, which means Lutris can show all your games, installed or not, although it means that you have to set your Steam profile to public. GOG support has also been improved, and you can now download GOG extras at the same time you install a game. Design has been revised and is now cleaner, and you can add titles to a new favorites section. Lutris runners can also now be written in JSON instead of Python, which could open up Lutris to more developers. It's a big release and I recommend you update if you haven't already. Collabora has now put their gaming patches to the Linux kernel for review. This set of patches aim to help Windows games work with better performance on Linux. It's not geared toward helping with anti-cheats, but it's trying to solve the issue that more and more Windows games bypass the Windows APIs and make their call directly to the kernel. This means that Wine has no chance to emulate them and it ends up failing because the Linux kernel can't really understand these calls. The goal of the patches is therefore to allow these calls to be redirected to user space instead of the kernel and be passed through Wine instead. It seems it would mostly help with support for various DRMs, so it's a good thing. We'll have to see if this patch set is accepted or not, but I'm all for anything that can make Linux gaming even easier. Wine 5.22 was released, with even more libraries converted to the PE format, improvements to the startup times by caching the fonts, better video playback, and 3DES cipher support. It also fixes 36 bugs, including for Overwatch, Fallout New Vegas, the Elite Dangerous launcher and the Guild Wars 2 launcher, Rome Total War, Thronebreaker: The Witcher Tales, Call of Duty Modern Warfare or Anno 1800. Nvidia will officially support Linux with its GeForce Now service using Google Chrome. There is no word on an official app for GeForce Now, and Linux users could already play games using the Chrome browser since Nvidia supported Chrome OS already, but this time they mentioned Linux specifically as a supported platform for the future. This won't make a difference to people already using the service on Linux, but it still means that we'll get official support, so if something goes wrong, we won't be left in the dust, which is nice. Valve has finally updated the Proton container runtime in Proton 5.13. If that's all mumbo-jumbo to you, just know that it means that overlays like Mango HUD or post-processing layers like VK Basalt couldn't run on Proton games because of the way the game was contained and isolated from the core Linux system. Now this will be fixed in Proton 5.13, which isn't yet available, but that you can try by switching to the beta of the Linux Steam runtime. That's a good step forward. And let's finish this video with some Firefox news. Firefox 83 was released and it brings a big change. The Warp update to their JavaScript engine is now on by default. This change comes with big improvements to performance, up to 20% faster in fact, for example in opening Google Docs. It also seems to reduce memory usage, which is a very nice side effect. Mozilla touts 15% faster page loads and pages that are 12% more responsive, although how they measured that isn't really disclosed. In use, Firefox 83 does feel faster, but I'll have to run a few tests to see if there's a real improvement. Firefox 83 also comes with an optional HTTPS-only mode, and the new web render is now deployed to more users, although it's still not the default on Linux. And that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed. Don't hesitate to like or dislike if you didn't. You can also subscribe and turn on notifications for more Linux news videos like this one. And if you really want to help support the channel, don't hesitate to check out my Patreon page or my YouTube page. The links are in the description below. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!